All right, Kim, what's on your radar today?
Well, in the past few days, we've seen increasing reports regarding foul play by China. Reports of ramped up aggressions against Taiwan have been all over the news. Chinese jets menace Taiwan, pressuring U.S. support of island's defenses. Record number of China planes enter Taiwan air defense zone. Taiwan preparing for possible war with China. On top of China's reported military threats against Taiwan, other horrific reports have been coming out regarding the government's treatment of the Uyghurs. Former Xinjiang police officer blows the whistle on mass torture of Uyghurs. The methods included shackling people to a metal or wooden tiger chair, hanging people from the ceiling, sexual violence, electrocutions, and waterboarding. CNN has been showcasing the Uyghur prison whistleblower all over their newscasts. Various outlets and pundits are now sounding the alarm that we're headed towards war with China. But I want us to take a step back, look at the reality of the situation, and try to learn for once from our historical mistakes. Now, first of all, I think it's important to point out that our nation has been in some sort of perpetual war since World War II, whether it be actual devastating boots on the ground conflicts such as the Korean War, Vietnam War, the various Middle East wars, the war in Afghanistan, or the non-combative yet highly expensive Cold War with the Soviets. We've been a nation constantly needing to flex our military might. Now that the war in Afghanistan is over-ish, our war drums can't help but to begin beating themselves in a new direction, further east. Now, essentially, the military-industrial complex needs to continue making money, and nothing could be more lucrative than a new Cold War with China. If you thought the war in Afghanistan was expensive, just wait until the foe we face isn't just a group of unsophisticated tribesmen in the Afghan mountains, but a developed nuclear nation with a population 4 to 5 times our size. Last month, in preparation for the new ramped-up war sight set on China, the U.S. announced a new security pact with Australia and the U.K. called AUKUS. It's essentially a new NATO, but rather than counter Soviet expansion, the pact is meant to counter the influence of China in the Indo-Pacific region. Now, remember, the U.S. is all the way over here on the other side of the globe. The U.K. is all the way in Europe, and Australia is way down under. And yet these three countries have now gotten together to ensure China doesn't have a growing influence in its own region. The U.S., U.K., and Australia have hundreds of military bases and outposts all around the world. China has fewer than 5. Yet the narrative we're all supposed to buy into is that China is the aggressor who must be stopped. Now, China is an economic competitor. That is true. They are growing in economic influence, and sooner than later, it seems inevitable that they will become the world's new superpower. That is, unless we can stop them. Now, how can we stop them? Well, history has shown us, as in the case of the USSR, that a nation can collapse when it's forced to focus its time and energy on war. And you don't even have to fire a single bullet to do it. You just need to get them to focus on an arms race while their people starve. So rather than build up our own competitive edge and invest in our country to ensure we nurture the best and the brightest, the strategy in Washington is to instead bully China into giving up their lunch money. It's a losing strategy. The bully never wins in the end. Eventually, everyone grows up, and the smart kid who invested in themselves ends up with all the money, the fast cars, and the nice house, while the bully is still trying to find relevance by talking about how cool they once were back in high school. This is where we're headed. But we can only head that way if the American people consent to it. Now, this is where Taiwan and the Uyghurs come in. The players in Washington know the right strings to pull to get the American people to buy into war. It's a little different for the left and the right, but you can easily figure out the trigger points. For the left, it's human rights abuses. The war lobby knows if they use buzzwords like genocide or sexual abuse, people on the left will begin to not only agree with, but demand some sort of military intervention. At a later time, I will go deeper into the Uyghur crisis and explain what's going on. But for now, it's best to stay on high alert when hearing stories that break your heart. Are they entirely true, or is someone trying to get you to pound your own war drum? There are definitely human rights abuses being committed in Chinese prisons. I have no doubt about that. I don't think there's a single prison in the world that isn't guilty of this. But to call what's happening to the Uyghurs genocide or ethnic cleansing is inaccurate. The Uyghurs have been one of the most fertile recruitment grounds for al-Qaeda and other terrorist organizations. And if we're not careful, we could end up repeating 1980s Afghanistan when we cited and funded the Mujahideen. Now, Taiwan is another complicated issue that isn't very cut and dry, but without hashing out the details of Taiwan and China's entire history and the internal conflict about their status as a nation, let's just address the claims that China is ramping up aggressions by flying its jets in Taiwan's airspace. Take a look at this map. The orange lines are the Chinese flights Taiwan is talking about. The light blue shaded area around Taiwan is their actual airspace. And as you can see, the orange lines are not in that shaded area. So what are all of these reports referring to? Well, they're referring to an area titled the ADIZ, the Air Defense Identification Zone, and that zone is the blue dotted line that creates this rectangle, much of which actually goes right over mainland China. You can see that. The ADIZ zone was created by the U.S., actually, and is not internationally recognized as actual airspace. And the point of this drawn zone is to allow countries the right to monitor all aircraft in the area to catch unwanted threats that may head toward the country. And with Taiwan's ADIZ encompassing much of mainland China itself, they could claim hundreds of flights are in their air zone each day. But you can see from this map that China has not entered Taiwan's actual airspace. Now, once again, China is an economic competitor. They are not faultless, and they definitely are doing things to try to undercut and weaken us through IP theft and currency manipulation. And we need to aggressively counter China, but we need to be smarter about it and counter through competition, not through debilitation. They are playing a strategic game of Go, while we're playing a guessing game of Battleship. It's only going to result in us spending gobs of money, making the military-industrial complex wealthier, while we, the American people, are told we can't use our tax dollars for things like universal pre-K, healthcare, or college because we can't afford it. Well, we can afford it if we stop these endless warmongering. We just ended one war weeks ago. The last thing we need to do is ramp up a Cold War with a behemoth that ends up costing us many times more. But the media, the war hawks, and the war lobby are already greasing the wheels for more war while manipulating us into going along with it. Curious your take on this, both Emily and Ryan. What are you thinking about this ramped up rhetoric with China? Curious, Emily, do you think China's an actual, foe that we need to maybe flex our military muscles against?
Well, so flexing our military muscles, I guess, is a different question, and that's kind of exactly what my response is, in that two things can be true at the same time. It is true that the military-industrial complex can be using the disgusting human rights abuses that the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese government is committing for their own ends, because they're hawkish and they're hungry, and I think you do see that absolutely in the rhetoric surrounding Taiwan. That is completely true. I think it is also true that China is provoking countries that are defenders of freedom, and there's no equivocation. There's no equivalence between what China is doing, which is ethnic cleansing of Uyghur Muslims, and that is, BuzzFeed News has incredible reporting on that. We've interviewed people who have come out of the camps in Xinjiang. It is ethnic cleansing. There are reports of forced sterilization. There are people who say they have endured forced sterilization. This is a grave human rights abuse on a scale that is far greater than problems with our own prisons, which do exist. And so I think two things can be true. And so I absolutely agree with that instinct for nuance. And I do think that hawks are exploiting some of that to ramp up, perhaps to whet our appetites for a military conflict with China 100%.
Yeah. And I think what's happening in Xinjiang is maybe easier to be understood as a cultural genocide. There's a real effort to just completely, wipe away the culture that has been there for hundreds of years. And I don't think it's accurate to refer to them as kind of another version of a mujahideen. And I kind of object to this idea that exists a lot online, that if you criticize China or anything that the Chinese government has done, then you are necessarily calling for war, or you are supporting the war effort. It's not only do I think that there's no logical connection between those two things, I actually think it's a little bit naive, because underlying it is the assumption that if you don't participate in these criticisms of cultural genocide going on among the Uyghur population, then the war hawks won't wage war on China. But that's absurd. Like, there are structural forces, and there are entire industries that are pushing in that direction, completely regardless of whether or not you voice accurate criticisms of what the Chinese government is doing. And I think Emily said it well, that both things can be true at once. And so, I don't think we should shrink from our obligation, to be critical of human rights abuses that are happening anywhere on the globe.
Well, interestingly, every Muslim country minus Turkey, I believe, actually is in alignment with China.
I don't want to hear from the United Arab Emirates or Saudi Arabia on human rights. I just don't care what they have to say about human rights. No, but I mean regarding
whether or not there's an actual ethnic cleansing going on against Muslims in China.
They have their own geopolitical reasons, and pointing to the idea that, well, these people are Muslims and they say nothing bad is happening there is just not a serious inquiry into what's actually happening when we can talk to people who escaped from it.
Yeah, they've been. Yeah,
sure. I mean, they're separatists. There is definitely a separatist movement, so you're going to get two sides of a story for sure. You're going to get people that absolutely want to break away from China. They want their own place. And so I think that right now it's way too early for anybody to make any sort of claims that
I think it's way too late. It's way too late. There was a separatist movement, and it was quite effectively smashed with incredibly brutal tactics, and there's nothing wrong with just saying that.
But that doesn't mean we
need to go to war over it.
Right, that's another case of both things being true, right? Like it can be true that there was a separatist movement that was then smashed by authoritarian, culturally genocidal, and wildly abusive tactics by the CCP.
Right, and you just thoroughly lose all your credibility if you deny it.
I don't agree with that. I think it's the other way around, actually.
Okay.
But
I guess my question is, what scale of on what scale do you think that the CCP is abusing Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang?
I'm sure that the scale, I'd say it's very similar to what we do here in the United States when it comes to Patriot Act and carting people off to Guantanamo Bay. I'm sure it's a very.
But we don't put an entire people in camps based on their religious identity.
I think Guantanamo Bay has Guantanamo at this point is dozens of people.
Right, but you cannot make the claim by any stretch of any imagination that all of the Uyghurs are suddenly disappearing into these camps. If you go to Xinjiang, they're there. You can see them.
They aren't. No, they aren't. But this is a very real fear of the Uyghur people in Xinjiang. Right. First of all, we can't. We do have satellite images, and we have the testimony of people who have escaped the camps, and the relatives, and there's corroborating evidence here, and all of the other countries have reason to defend China because they're in bed with China for economic reasons and the way that China supports their economy, and the way that they hope China will support their economy. But I will say, I think the reality that people are being put in camps based on their identities. It's not every Uyghur Muslim, but it is a huge chunk of the Uyghur Muslims that have at least gone through them and cycled through them and maybe have been released. But at the same time, there's this enormous fear. You have members of the CCP going into their homes. It's just an incredible invasion of privacy and of freedom, and I don't think there's any equivalence.
They're literally not allowed to practice their religion. They're literally
not allowed to practice Salafist Wahhabism. That is absolutely correct. They're not allowed to practice Salafist Sunni Islam, which is the more radical version. That is what China has banned. That is true. So even if a person's not a criminal,
what is going on here? There's no. Do you think that there's some other mosque that they're able to attend? What are you talking about?
Muslims in China. I mean, there's
a Chinese government. There's one Chinese government-sanctioned mosque that they're allowed to attend, and therefore there's no cultural genocide going on.
To practice Salafist. Yes, it's banned to practice Salafist.
I would encourage you to read some of the dispatches, from people who have experienced this.
Extensive research
and not through the prism
of testimony.
Some of it, but not all of it. No, I do think that there's definitely, like I mentioned, human rights abuses going on for sure. I mean, it's prison. It's like Guantanamo Bay. There's definitely stuff going on that shouldn't be going on. But to call it an ethnic genocide is what I take issue with specifically, and I think that's warmongering language.
So if you compare what the culture was, 20 years ago to what it is today, would you not acknowledge that they've obliterated the culture?
I would say the culture shifted. It became more.
That's a weird passive way to describe what happened. It didn't just passively shift. the Chinese government shifted it, right? By policy.
More radical religion kind of infiltrated, and we see this happening in lots of areas around the world, as we've seen.
Well, then why? Yes, there are radicals here in the United States. So does that justify like a massive crackdown sweeping up people?
Do you think that the Republican Party has changed? Do you think it's become more radical right wing? I mean, things changed.
I just don't think that's a productive, I guess, parallel. And it seems to me that we're not going to agree on the scale of the abuses. But I do think that we can agree that we can walk and chew gum at the same time, that there are different things going on. And that's that. I guess.
I mean, there were a handful of terrorist attacks.
Yes.
There are also terrorist attacks here in the United States. We would never say, okay, well then, therefore, we're going to ban the Christians.
And it's an ethnic, and it's on the basis of an ethnic identity. This is not just a religious identity; it's an ethnic identity.
Right.
Yeah. It depends, right? But I don't agree that they're actually doing that. I think that
you just did agree to it. You said that you did agree that the culture that exists today is radically different as a result of Chinese policy.
It's been suppressed on a
No, I don't agree with that. That's not what I said. But I'll do a whole piece on the Uyghurs, and we can talk about this another time.
No, let's not actually do that. Okay,
All right.
Go.
Well, thank you so much for watching. Yeah. We'll have more Rise coming up.